I think it might be prudent to start off by saying that I'm a little under the weather today, so this video might just be reflective of a more melancholic mood, and so if it seems a little bit combative or overly assertive, maybe just take it with a grain of salt. I've seen a lot of attention lately paid towards the disruptiveness of those pesky radical traditionalists, or the rad-trads as they've been referred to in editorials and podcasts and the like. And I think it's fair to say that they have a fairly bad reputation for being considered intolerant, rude, cranky, and just generally uncharitable. And while I'd agree that there are some high-profile personalities who have volunteered to be the standard bearers for traditional Catholicism, I'd like to suggest that they aren't a very accurate representation of traditional or even traditionalist Catholicism. And since by some estimates I might be considered a traditionalist myself, I thought I'd offer some thoughts that might shift or hopefully expand at least your perspective on those quarrelsome rad-trads. A couple of points of contention that I want to focus in on is the consistent comparison to the Pharisees in biblical times, as well as just the general intolerance and combativeness of traditionalists. So starting with that first one, I myself was accused of acting like a Pharisee when I refused to continue attending a liturgy that was plagued with abuses and showed a lot of contempt for the church's instruction on how the liturgy should be performed, instead preferring to attend the extraordinary form or the traditional Latin Mass, where I knew those kinds of abuses just wouldn't exist. So is that an apt comparison between traditionalists and the Pharisees? And if so, what was so bad about the Pharisees that we Christians might want to avoid? For anyone reading the New Testament, it's obvious that the Pharisees are the bad guys. They continually and routinely collide with Jesus over his teaching ministry, and they eventually are involved in the plot against him to first silence him and then eventually to have him removed and executed. So obviously that's the kind of association that no Christian is going to want to be branded with. But was everything about them rotten all the way through? It seems to me that these comparisons between traditionalists and the Pharisees is often based on their rigidity and their refusal to compromise and their strict adherence to the faith. But is that really such a bad thing? Scripture routinely tells us that we are to stand firm, to be steadfast, and to keep the commandments. Joshua 23:6, among countless Old Testament verses, says to be very firm and to do all that is written in the law of Moses. 1 Corinthians 15:58 says to be steadfast and immovable, always abounding in work of the Lord. Ephesians 6:13 says to put on the full armor of God so that when the day of evil comes, we will be able to stand our ground. And in John 2:17, right after Jesus cleanses the temple from profane things, his disciples recall that it is written that zeal for your house will consume me. So firmness, steadfastness, and religious zeal, these are all things that are encouraged in a big way in Scripture. So if that's not wrong, what is it about the Pharisees that we should be critical of? I would say that it's their pride and hypocrisy. Because the more serious you take something, anything, the more you are going to be tempted towards pride as a result of that thing. The more accomplished, for example, I've been in my career, the more I'm tempted to compare myself to other people and to allow my pride to swell. And that's not a temptation that existed before when I was struggling with other things. And it's no different with religion. It's a good thing for us to grow in our faith, our practice, and our understanding and our adherence to the faith. There's no doubt about that. But as we do so, the focus of our range of temptations will shift from maybe a lack of discipline and courage towards a lack of humility. Because the more disciplined and knowledgeable we become in the faith, the more we will be tempted by pride. The enemy will gladly allow us to grow in certain virtues if it means that he can secure our soul through pride. And this same temptation is a serious threat for Traditionalist Catholics, because in my experience, among the ones that I know, traditional Catholics tend to be ones who really immerse themselves and challenge themselves to grow in the practice and in the understanding of their faith. But as we do so, we also need to be growing in humility. Humility needs to be one of our highest priorities as we grow in the faith. And yes, this kind of pride is present in traditional communities in the faith, but I would like to suggest that it's less pervasive than it appears, and it probably has more to do with, again, those public personalities who have tried to cast themselves as the standard bearers for traditional Catholicism. And of course, celebrity Catholics are going to be even more tempted by pride and hypocrisy. So I wouldn't allow some of those louder and more obnoxious voices to shape your perception of what the average traditional Catholic is like. Twitter is not an accurate representation for what most people who attend the traditional Latin Mass are like. In fact, from what I've seen, most are quite indifferent towards social media and the modern obsession with our devices. The few who are on Twitter, I would say, are the exception. So again, don't let that create your perception of what most traditionalists are like. So what about the charge of being intolerant and combative towards more modernist or contemporary forms of Catholicism? Well, I think we as a church need to be very honest with ourselves on all sides of the spectrum and of the fence, or whatever analogy you want to use. Because this fight, this factionalism that exists within our church, it's not going away, and trying to sweep it under the rug and ignore it is not helping things. And because it is something like an internal fight or struggle, if you want to cast certain groups with a measure of blame, maybe the first place to start is by asking who shot first. Because in any fight, in any conflict, according to church teaching, self-defense is not only permissible, but it's just. Well, what we now consider to be traditional Catholicism in the Roman Rite was for hundreds of years previously just Catholicism. It was what everyone practiced and believed. And then about half a century ago, certain church leaders decided that that version of Catholicism, especially the practice of the liturgy, was inadequate and needed to be renovated. In other words, they rejected it as it was and sought to change it to fit more contemporary or secular even sensibilities. And they did not consult the vast majority of Catholics who presumably cherished the faith that they had been formed in. Those people just showed up to Mass one day and it had been dramatically changed out from under them without their consultation. And many of those changes conflicted with well-documented church teaching, and I'll go into that a little bit more in a future video. And for those who wanted to retain that practice of their faith, that practice that they had been raised in, and which was the context for some of their most important and cherished memories, like initiation into the church, marriages, and funerals, not to mention their weekly, if not daily, reception of the Eucharist, they rejected these innovations, and as a result, they were branded as intolerant and rigid. But in the whole scope of that transaction, that rejection goes both ways. Remember, it was the innovators and the renovators who first rejected the faith and the practice of the faith as it was, and then used that as a premise to go and reinvent it. And then that traditional practice of the faith, especially in the liturgy and in the Mass, was withheld from them until several generations later, when Pope Benedict XVI made a provision so that the Latin Mass could be said again, with much hysterical objection from the modernists. So if we're going to characterize traditionalist Catholics as being intolerant, we should remember that it was the innovators who first expressed their intolerance for the traditional Catholic liturgy of the Church, of the Roman Rite. And therefore, the antagonism of traditionalists should be better described as a measure of self-defense rather than aggression. Thank you so much for watching that. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you got something out of it. And if you did, and you want to consume more content like this, then please consider subscribing to my channel. Or if you saw this on Facebook, then like my page and follow along. If you're on YouTube, it's not enough anymore to subscribe because YouTube wants to think that it can tell you what you should watch instead of what you actually want to watch. So in this case, you actually have to hit that little bell to be notified as to whether or not I've uploaded something more recently. So please subscribe and hit the bell at the same time. That really helps me out a lot. And if you could consider sharing this among your social network, that helps me a lot too. And if you want to support the making of these videos, please consider supporting my business, which is a communications and strategic marketing company who specializes especially in branding and web design. And this is especially catered towards ministries and apostolates and parishes. We have a parish web design system that we've built specifically for parishes and churches that is affordable, but also beautifully packaged and easy to use. So if you're interested in that, check out my business, which is holdsworthdesign.com, and hit the contact button in the navigation and get in touch, and we can figure out if there's a good fit for you there.